My name is Henry Louis Gates Jr., and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this marvelous event. Dean Gay, Dean Elmendorf, Dean Bobo, esteemed guests. It's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight as we mark the retirement of our beloved colleague, the revered William Julius Wilson. I grew up in a place called Piedmont, West Virginia, in what was essentially an Irish-Italian immigrant village nestled in the Allegheny Mountains on the Potomac River. And it's about halfway between Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C. It's a paper mill town. Piedmont's black community was very small. There were only 2,300 people in it, so the black people amounted to about 12% the year I was born, 1950. And the black population in the county, Mineral County, amounted to about 3%. But the black community was quite vibrant, with several of its own segregated churches, representing a bundle of denominations, segregated fraternal orders such as the Black Elks and the Black Masons, and separate public schools until 1955, just a year after Brown v. Board, when all of the colored schools in our county were miraculously, overnight, integrated. But the most important secular organization was the colored VFW, as we called it. And that's where my father and his friends gathered every weekday after the paper mill whistle blew at 3:30 in the afternoon to down a drink or two before going home to dinner with their families. And whenever I was home from college at Yale, or on spring break or Thanksgiving break from teaching here at Harvard, I absolutely loved sitting on those old red linoleum cracking bar stools and downing a water glass full of scotch, or two, with my father and his buddies. So one day at the VFW, just totally out of the blue, my father commanded me, tell them, boy. Now, my father lived to be 97 and a half. Many of you knew him very well. He lived to be 97 and a half, and up to his dying day, he called me boy. So tell him what, Pop? I said, but I knew what he wanted to know. He said, tell him how much you guys up there at Harvard work. Well, Daddy, I responded with as much fervor as I could muster. I teach one course on Monday and Wednesday, and it lasts 50 minutes each day. And then on Tuesdays, I teach another course, a seminar, and that lasts for about 2 hours. That's it? Mr. Ozzie Washington blurted out, wide-eyed. That's all the work you people do up there? Man, he continued, when I began to protest and explain how difficult and complicated our lives as academics were. He said, you guys can never retire because you retired already. Loud and generous laughter at the expense of Harvard academics filled the colored VFW. And I did my best to defend our honor. But sadly, academics do retire. And we have gathered here from across this campus, and indeed from across the American Academy, to celebrate the career of one of our most devoted and beloved colleagues and friends, the Louis P. and Linda L. Geiser University Professor Emeritus, William Julius Wilson. Give it up again for Bill. Bill, after being in denial for several months, as you know, and attempting surreptitiously to enlist your wonderful wife, Jo, and my buddy, Larry Bobo, in a devious plot designed to change your mind completely, we decided that we'd continue to be in denial and invite you not only to keep your suite of offices at the Hutchins Center, but also to continue to serve as the chair of the selection committee for the Du Bois Research Institute's fellowship program. And I'm pleased to announce that Bill has accepted both. So thankfully, this is just a 3-day goodnight and not a goodbye, which frankly, I personally would have found devastating. Over the next 2 days, you're going to hear about Bill's remarkable work and about the influence he's had on the field of sociology and on public policy in this country. From the people who know him best, his colleagues, his collaborators, and most impressively, many of the students that he's trained from the last almost half a century, 50 years. Students who have themselves become the top researchers of the nation on the complex forms of inequality, structural and behavioral, that continue to plague our cities and their residents, generation after generation. Work devoted to charting in precise statistical detail both how things change and yet how things, oddly, remain the same. And research on the creative and innovative programs to address these forms of inequality that government programs and private capital could provide. Then, in just a short while, my dear friend and colleague, Professor Cornel West, will deliver this evening's keynote address. You could consider me the warm-up act for the main event, which, as we all know, will be dazzling, brilliant, at once insightful and resonant, and heartfelt, as are all of Cornel's words. What I will offer very briefly are reflections on how Bill came to Harvard, and also how he came to be, indirectly, who he is today. But first, allow me to acknowledge the many partners with whom the Hutchins Center worked to bring this remarkable gathering together: the Office of the President, the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and the Division of Social Science, the Harvard Kennedy School, the Department of African and African American Studies, the Department of Sociology, and the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy at the K School. We gratefully acknowledge the Harvard Graduate School of Education Office and Development and Alumni Relations, and of course the Radcliffe Institute for sharing their space with us this evening. Most of all, let's thank the executive director of the Hutchins Center, Dr. Abby Wolf, right there, for making what could have been an arduous task a feast and labor of love. And please give a warm welcome to Bill's family members up here who have traveled so very far to celebrate his career today. Welcome. To the several and various generations of the Wilson family. Now, I'm going to cede the stage for a few minutes for the appearance electronically, digitally, by a surprise guest. Someone who wanted to be here, but sadly told me he couldn't be here in person because of a previous engagement, but he wanted to wish Bill well on this momentous occasion. Could we play the video, please? That, in case the fog of amnesia has descended since the last general election, was the 42nd president of the United States. We still miss you, dear brother. In fact, we miss you more and more every day. Give it up for Bill Clinton. Now, the story of Bill's recruitment, in which Al Gore, vice president to Bill Clinton, actually played a part. When Anthony Appy and I came to Harvard in 1991, we made a list of scholars, superstars. Well, I don't think we were scarred, but it's been a lot of years. Superstars whom we would like ideally to recruit. And on that list, among other names, were Jamaica Kincaid, Evelyn, and the Honorable Leon A. Higginbotham, Cornel West, and of course, the greatest prize of all, William Julius Wilson, who had turned down not one, but 2 university professorship offers from Harvard by the time that Anthony and I got to town in 1991. With a great deal of support from the president and the deans of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and the Divinity School, we had been quite fortunate in our recruitment percentage so far. In fact, by 1994, we were 4 for 4, but we wanted Bill Wilson. So I called Ruth Simmons, trusted advisor and a good friend, who was then the vice provost at Princeton. This is before Ruth went on to become president of Smith and then of Brown. And I asked her, how should we make the pitch? How do you recruit William Julius Wilson? After all, I hadn't even met William Julius Wilson. I only knew him through his books and his many op-ed page pieces for the Times. And Ruth said, well, it's simple. Pick up the phone, call him up, invite him to lunch, offer him a job. That's it. That's it. Try it. So after a lot of Gaviscon for dessert dinners and restless nights, I summoned up the courage to call William Julius Wilson. Professor Wilson, as I addressed him when we spoke on the phone, and as I would do later. And I asked him, might he have time to have lunch with me? He invited me to the University Club on the campus of the University of Chicago. I was quite nervous, I have to confess, but I made the case as strongly as I could that Evelyn, Leon, Cornel, Jamaica, and Anthony and I were trying to do a great thing, a unique thing in the history of our people, trying to build a great center for the study of our people beyond ego by bringing together the world's top scholars, black and white, to the world's greatest university. Then I believe that we were experiencing a once-in-a-generation moment in time in which to do this, that we had the wind at our backs. Everything was on a roll, but to achieve the greatness that we wanted to achieve, we needed another person. We needed him. Bill stared at me for a few minutes, and then he smiled. I waited expectantly. He didn't say the following words exactly, but the expression on his face said something like, you know, you're cute, kid. It sort of reminded me of an expression I'd seen on Willie Mays' face. One day, after a Pirates-Giant game at the old Forbes Field in the late 50s, like Bill's hometown, our hometown was close enough to Pittsburgh that we could go to several games over the course of the season, especially when the Pirates played the Dodgers, because that was Jackie Robinson, or the Giants, that was Willie Mays. You didn't go to Piedmont's halfway, as I said, to D.C., but the American League didn't have black players. The National League did, so you'd always go to the Giants. And my father's hero to the day he died was Willie Mays. So I watched him closely when we were at the games, and I read all I could about him. I followed him in Jet and Ebony. And a kid one day, the bat boy, had asked Willie Mays to sign a baseball. And then he said he wanted to grow up to be just like him, just like Willie Mays. And I watched Willie sign that ball and rub the kid's head with an expression like, you're cute, kid. Keep dreaming, because that ain't never, ever going to happen. Well, that's how I felt, ladies and gentlemen, when Bill looked at me after I finished my halting, bumbling, nervous recruitment appeal at the University Club on the campus of the University of Chicago. The answer, he said, was no. Not interested in moving, kid. Not interested in Harvard. He was a university professor already. He taught in the finest sociology department in the world, of which he had been chair. And he had turned down Harvard twice already. Young man, he said to me, you were aware of that before you came out here today, were you not? And besides, Hannah Gray, the president, formidable president in the University of Chicago, would never let him leave, he said, even if he wanted to, which he did not. But he thanked me quite generously for the offer, asked if I wanted any dessert. I said no. Then he rose and said he had a class to teach. On the way to the door, he politely and genuinely asked if he could give me a lift to my next appointment in Chicago or at the university. And I told him, that I had no other appointment, that I had flown out to Chicago simply to have lunch with him. And now I was heading straight back to O'Hare. There was a certain look on his face that I shall never forget. "You did that for me?" he asked. "Yes, sir, I did." Nothing could be more important to building what we are dreaming of building than enjoying the pleasure of your companionship on our faculty in Afro-Am at Harvard, I said to him from the heart. And with that, I climbed into my taxi, I licked my wounds, and flew back to Cambridge. Well, cut to February 1995. A few years later, then Vice President Albert Gore had convened 3 salon-style dinners at his official residence, number 1 Observatory Circle, bringing together under the guidance of Bill's friend and former Chicago colleague, my intellectual godfather, John Hope Franklin. Bringing together thinkers and scholars who could talk to each other and educate him about the multiple ways people were experiencing race in this country. This was Clinton's warm-up for the race initiative, which they would announce a year later. Now, Bill Wilson was at the first of those dinners, and so was I. I, uncomfortably sandwiched between Shelby Steele and his equally charming and conservative wife, Rita. Now, after what seemed like hours of defending affirmative action and the Clinton presidency from this 2-pronged Steele attack at the dining table of Clinton's own vice president, I felt someone tap me on the shoulder to my enormous relief. And I looked up, and to my great surprise, it was William Julius Wilson. He asked if he could have a word with me. Now? In a whisper, in the corner of the dining room, he told me that if Harvard's offer was still open, he was ready to accept. But he didn't want to dilly and dally. We need to let him know. I returned to my place at the table. Now, I wasn't quite sure if I had heard correctly or if I was engaged in wishful thinking, since I had consumed far too much wine trying to remain calm and even-keeled, caught in the swirl of the right-wing storm being generated by my 2 utterly relentless and ruthlessly unbending dinner partners. I looked over across the room at Bill for a double check, and he nodded, as if knowing I needed confirmation that I hadn't been dreaming. I mean, this came totally out of the blue. When I realized that Bill was as serious can get, I excused myself as discreetly as I could and pretended to go to the men's room. Outside the men's room, I dialed the president of Harvard University, Neil Rudenstein, at his home, and in a whisper told his formidably protective wife, Angelica, that this was indeed an emergency, madam. It's about 10 o'clock at night. I apologized for calling it home so late. She put Neil on the phone. And then I related to Neil the conversation I just had down the hall with Bill and asked, what was I to do? He said, you hang up, turn around, and go back and make him the offer. Tell him whatever it takes. I returned to the dining table. I sat down between my 2 torturers. I caught Bill's eye. Thumbs up. The game, as Bobo and my hero, Sherlock Holmes, like to put it, was afoot. Game on. And what a great game it was. Anthony Appiah, Evelyn and Leon Higginbotham, Cornel West, and about half of anybody who was anybody at the time related to Bill's interests in sociology, public policy, Afro-Am, along with the provost, because Neil and Angelica were out of town, Al Carnesale, came to our house on Francis Avenue, and we wined and dined him at a recruitment dinner party to remember. And the rest, as they say, ladies and gentlemen, is history. Within a year of that dinner at Al Gore's house, Bill had said yes, and on July 1st, 1996, William Julius Wilson joined Harvard's faculty as the Malcolm Weiner Professor of Social Policy, and in 1998, he became the Lewis P. and Linda L. Geiser University Professor. Same time Cornel West became a university professor. As I watched Bill at his first faculty meeting in our department, I couldn't help but think of Willie Mays and that cute little bat boy. Now, in my little time remaining, I'm not going to recount Bill's countless distinctions or recite the highlights of his 58-page single-spaced CV. But what I'd like to share is what I've learned about his personal history, and as some of you know, I happen to have an interest in that. The great sociologist had humble beginnings, as did so many of us in this room. He was the eldest of 6, born to Esco and Pauline Wilson, maiden name Bracey, in Bairdstown, Pennsylvania, a small village about 40 miles east of Pittsburgh on the Conemaugh River, quite near the Allegheny Mountains. As it happens, my own Piedmont is just 89 miles from Bairdstown. Bill's devoted much of his career to thinking about the influence of neighborhoods on life chances. Perhaps there's something to explore in the Black experience in rural communities. Incidentally, Bill, I was emailing Drew Faust a couple hours ago. Drew also grew up, she sends her warmest regards. Drew also grew up near our Allegheny Mountain range, some 180 miles from Bairdstown, about 80 miles on from Piedmont on the Shenandoah River. It's so ironic that the world's expert on the Black urban experience grew up not immersed at all in city life, but in the sociocultural experience of rural Black America. So we wanted to give you 2 gifts this evening, Bill. And if you come forward, I'll be happy to present the first. Oh, big and bad, I like that. Okay. Come over here. Sit down. Pull your chair up so you can see this. Okay. All right. Matt, you ready? This is Bill Wilson's family tree. Yeah, you can take it off there. Good? Now, Bill, if you pull up your chair, I'm going to walk you through the generations briefly. Esco Wilson, your father, was born in Georgia. Pauline Bracey Wilson, your mother, was born in Georgia. Pauline was known as Pinky and changed her name. They were part of the Great Migration, the movement, as everybody in this room knows, of Southern rural Black people, first to cities in the South and then to the industrial North. A population shift that has been key to your work and indeed to your entire field. Bill, on your dad's side, we were able to trace your ancestry back almost 200 years. To your great-great-grandparents, you could see them there. Their names were Charles Mickens and Paula Ellington, both of whom were born into slavery around 1825 in Virginia. In 1848, the year your great-grandmother Jane Elizabeth Mickens was born, they lived in Richmond, still enslaved. Your mother was called Pinky. Obviously, as all the Black people here know, she was called Pinky because of her fair complexion. Your father's history is the social history of our people, Bill. On her side, your mother's side of your family tree, we traced your ancestry, and you can see there, you find yourself at the bottom, go up to the right, your mom's side. We traced your ancestry back to Edward Hunter and his wife Anna, who also are your great-great-grandparents, who lived in Dallas County, Alabama, when the 1870 federal census was taken. That's the first census, of course, with all of our ancestors listed by name, because except in half a dozen counties, enslaved people were not listed by name in the federal census. Now, while we couldn't prove who owned them and who owned their son Washington before the end of the Civil War, we think that quite probably their likely owner was a man named Judge John Stark Hunter. Can we show him, please? John Stark Hunter was a lawyer, a circuit judge, a member of both houses of the Alabama legislature. This is the man, Bill, whom we believe owned your family. He represented Dallas County at the state's post-Civil War Constitutional Convention in 1865. Judge Hunter also was a prominent planter in the region and owned at least 227 other slaves in 1860, and the 2,500-acre Hunter Plantation near Selma, Alabama. Only 312 men in the entire United States owned at least 200 slaves. And this man, from whom we believe your family took his name, was one of them. We could think of him as one of the Confederacy's 1%, a dubious honor indeed. And it seems likely that he did, in fact, own your mother's ancestors. We don't know if you have a genetic connection to him yet. Your mother did have a lot of European admixture, but if you would like subsequently to know, we can arrange that. Her high percentage of European admixture, of course, is how your mother Pauline got her name Pinky. Just under a century after this man's death in 1866, a historic voting rights campaign would see marchers in Selma beaten on their first attempt to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and eventually culminate, as we all know, in a march to the state capitol in Montgomery, where Dr. King reminded us that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Words that, indeed, we need to remind ourselves of every day. Bill, you were 29 years old at that time, and I wonder, did you have any idea that you had a family connection to Dallas County, Alabama, the site of this seminal chapter in the history of American racial relations? How far you have come from your beginnings, William Julius Wilson, and how far your people, our people, have come against the greatest odds your ancestors aspired and dreamed. They worshiped and prayed. They deferred gratification and saved. And despite all the horrors of slavery and Jim Crow, they refused to turn back and never lost the faith. And it was their deeply held beliefs and virtues that produced your remarkably accomplished siblings and children, and of course, that produced you, who would become, along with Cornel West, one of the first two black university professors in the long and curious history of Harvard University. Please accept this gift of your family tree to remind you of the story of the sacrifices your ancestors made and the dreams that they had that culminated in the triumph and glory of your marvelous career. I said we had two gifts. When we were trying to recruit Bill to build what the press called the Dream Team, I don't know where they got that idea, in what was then the Department of Afro-American Studies, we needed someone with depth, maturity, and the strongest mastery of quantitative method. Since we were all humanists, and Evelyn and I count history, only Harvard calls it social sciences. It's in the humanities. Since we were all humanists, someone who could deepen our exploration of the black experience through the social sciences. We needed the man, the scholar, whom Frederick Douglass looked toward, and I quote Douglass, some brave and truth-loving man with all the facts before him, uninfluenced by filial love and veneration for men, or party associations, or pride of name, who will gather from here and there the scattered fragments and give to those who shall come after us an impartial history of this, the grandest moral conflict of our time. We needed someone who could carry Du Bois's mantle, someone who could use history and social science as his weapons. As the great Du Bois wrote, and I quote, "The Negro problem was, in my mind, a matter of systematic investigation and intelligent understanding. The world was thinking wrong about race because it did not know. The ultimate evil," Du Bois continued, "was stupidity. The cure for it was knowledge based on scientific investigation," unquote. Like Du Bois, Bill, you believed in the power of facts and statistics. You believed in the indisputable authority of the scientific method. You set out to collect data above the din of the crowd, above politics, above political correctness, following this data wherever it led. And you suffered for it from time to time. Not all of our colleagues were ready to listen to your message about the complex relationship between race and class. But you were, as you so often have been, so far ahead of everyone else. Never once did you doubt yourself. Never once did you take the easy path and either retreat or turn back. You never wavered, dear brother. You never pandered to public opinion, not even black public opinion. And you never looked back. Your great gift, Bill Wilson, is the capacity, the genius to collect data that others hadn't noticed and transform that data into compelling narratives. And finally, like your predecessor, the great Du Bois, turn those narratives into metaphors for our time, metaphors for the human condition. Bill, you are the man Douglass and Du Bois called to come forward. With your corpus of research, scholarship, and publication, you have joined the immortals of your discipline, along with Du Bois and Weber, Durkheim and Spencer, St. Clair Drake, E. Franklin Frazier. There can be no doubt, my friend, that there is any danger at all, that your work ever will disappear. Glenn, could you please join me? Here you go, Hutch. Ladies and gentlemen, Glenn Hutchins, our patron, allowed us to create the Hutchins Center for African and African American Studies. Give it up for Glenn Hutchins, please. Bill? In recognition of your contributions to our understanding of the urban centers and the black lives that have fueled the growth of this country, it gives Glenn and me and the executive committee of the Hutchins Center the greatest honor before your wife, your children, your friends and colleagues, on behalf of your colleagues and your students, to present you, Bill Wilson, with the W.E.B. Du Bois Medal, Harvard's highest honor for excellence in African and African American studies. Congratulations, my dear friend, and thank you for all the joy you brought to our lives.
Thank you so very much. Listen, I'm going to save my remarks for the speech I'm giving on Friday. I just want to say this. Audrey, my sister, Dr. Audrey Harrington, I am so pleased that you're here because she's into the family tree business, believe me. And I know that you're going to, where is it? Well, okay. I'm just so glad you're here. Thank you. All right.
My soul looks back and wonders how I got over. That song was written by Clara Ward in 1951 at the age of 27. right outside of Jim Crow Atlanta with her mother Gertrude and her sister Willa. They were driving in a Cadillac and they were surrounded by white supremacists that vowed to kill them. Gertrude, the mother, feigned that she was speaking in tongues. And the white supremacists ran away and they got to the hotel and she wrote that song. And when you look at that tree, think of that history, the struggle, the shudder, the suffering, the joy, the resilience, the resistance, and then William Julius Wilson. That's just not any ordinary name. Do you feel the weight in that name? William Julius Wilson. The gravitas. My favorite 20th century poet, his name was W.H. Auden. He said about Freud, he was not a person or a name, he was a climate of opinion. William Julius Wilson. Yes, a name, indeed a person, but a whole climate of opinion. Because when you say his name, you think of a new paradigm in American social science, in modern social science, a new problematic in the language of old Louis Althusser, a whole matrix of issues, frameworks, new lenses to view the world from the vantage point of those catching hell. William Julius Wilson. I want to add a footnote to Brother Skip's story before I get into my story, because I didn't know you was going to do what you do, brother. But I got a letter, February 16th, 1996. This is from Skip Gates to Bill Wilson. On behalf of your colleagues and the president and the provost, I wish to share with you our enthusiasm and sheer joy at your decision to join us here at Harvard. The response on campus and indeed throughout the nation has been electric. William Julius Wilson. Students, faculty from other schools and departments at the university, friends from around the country have all hailed your decision as a great event in the history of our people. And I could not agree more. We now have an unprecedented critical mass of scholars dedicated to resisting, indeed challenging, the massive attempt of the right to dismantle the social safety nets that have at least attempted to ensure that our economic system remains humane at its fringes. Now, this is Skip Gates, y'all. This is my brother Skip. He goes on to say, not since the progressive era has capitalism been so in danger of decivilizing itself. You remember writing that, bro, Skip? Together here at this moment, we can collectively speak forcefully and thoughtfully against this troubled grain. We all realize how difficult your decision must have been, but not only we are deeply, underlines twice, appreciative that you made it, but we also believe you will not regret having made it. 23 and a half years later. Look at that smile on our brother's face. He doesn't regret it at all. He made the right decision. Please let me know if we can be of help in any way. We hope you can join us for a Black Tie Dinner Friday, hosted by President Rudenstein, launching the Du Bois Institute's endowment campaign and our historic conference marking the centennial of the Plessy v. Ferguson decision. C.C., Neil Rudenstein, Al Carsdale, Joseph Nye, Anthony Appiah, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. Where is Sister Evelyn? Where is she? You remember. Leon Higginbotham, John Kane, Randall Kennedy, Charles Ogletree, Orlando Patterson, Alvin Toussaint, Vernon Zolas, Cornel West. November 16, 1996. Here we are, 2019. My soul looks back and wonders how we got over. William Julius Wilson is an intellectual giant. He's a social scientific genius. He is a kind and tender and gentle and loving human being. You know how rare that is to get a combination of genius and generosity? Do you know how rare that is? It's not just a matter of shaping of mind, but it's soul craft. Now, he's a freedom fighter in the staunch social democratic mode. And by social democracy, what I mean is he's more progressive than liberals and less revolutionary than communists. Is that a fair characterization, oh brother? Now, I'm going to raise some questions about that Weberian conception of class he has rather than Marxist, but we will get to that now. But to begin with William Julius Wilson is to invite us into what it means to be a towering modern intellectual, predicated on three pillars: his sense of vocation, his sense of invocation, and his sense of provocation. Fascinating that black intellectuals like W.B. Du Bois, Anna Julia Cooper, Sinclair Drake, Martin Kielsen, let us never forget him, Toni Morrison, my God, they exemplify the heights of the very bases of the Western intellectual tradition. We've got to shatter this parochialism when we see towering black intellectuals and say they are black intellectuals solely, first, foremost. They are deeply black, but they're rooted in American, but they're deeply modern as well. And they go all the way back to the Socratic legacy of Athens and the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem. That if you want to understand this brother's genius, you're going to have to come to terms with Socrates. You're going to have to come to terms with paideia, that deep education, not that cheap schooling. That deep education that's based on the formation of attention, to attend to the things that matter, attend to the things that will unsettle you, attend to the things that will unnerve and unhouse you. Yes, talk about race and class, talk about intra-struggle within the black community, talk about a critique of the United States, not just from this country, but from the global perspective. His first text in 1973 was a comparative study, historical study of South Africa and the United States, always talking about the global changes and transformations within the capitalist economy, but also sensitive to the structures of feeling and the structures of value that go hand in hand with the culture's moments of those transformations. He's 38 years old. In 1973, in Power, Racism, and Privilege, the larger theoretical framework. And yes, you've talked about his parents, Esco Julius Wilson, who died when he was 12 years old. Pauline Bracey, can you imagine the level of courage, sacrifice, forbearance, resistance? Esco, Pauline constitute spiritual nobility and moral royalty in an American democratic experience against the backdrop of its own imperial expansion with white supremacist institutions shot through with class divisions and gender ones as well. But we keep track of their humanity. How did they do it? Those 6 precious kids in that house in Blairsville. I did a little research on Blairsville. Blairsville peaked in population roughly the year that our brother was born. 1935, they had 5,000 people. A daddy only got 3,800. Coal mining place. Blessed father was a coal miner. But then there's an aunt, the precious Aunt Janice. Janice Wardlaw. These are the ones who go into the shaping of the soul of a giant and a genius. That say over and over again, don't tell me how smart you are. I don't want to know simply about your degrees, your achievements. I also want to know what kind of human being you're going to be, how you're going to use your skills and your intellectual weaponry for something bigger than you, because you come from a place where you have been loved, you have been affirmed, you have been empowered, you have been enabled. You know, Aunt Janice was a sophisticated psychiatric social worker in the Big Apple. So she allows this country brother, rural brother, to come to New York. Let me show you some other kind of cultural sophistication. You got a whole lot of cultural sophistication in your church. The preacher ain't no dummy. An artist. The song sung like How I Got Over, written by geniuses, sung by a genius in 1963 named Mahalia Jackson for a brother who had a dream named Martin Luther King Jr. Sang that same song. And Aretha sang it in 1972 in Amazing Grace, didn't she? So he already got exposed to some cultural sophistication right there in Blairsville. But then when he came to New York, Harlem, city life, moving quick, talking fast, jazz all up and down the boulevard. You can imagine the impact on this genius in the making. And going back to talk to his family. And I'm off to Wilberforce, where Du Bois began his career. How you gonna get to Wilberforce, you broke as the 10 Commandments financially? Oh, there's some folk who love this little genius in the making. There's some church folk who are willing to give up their hard, their sacrificial money they worked hard for. This will help you out. And he goes there and studies sociology. Back to Bowling Green State University, on his way to Washington State University, ends up at University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and that was a critical mass. Fascinating folk. But the legacy of Socrates saying what? Deep education. Unexamined life is not worth living. Raise those difficult questions, Brother William Julius Wilson. Cut against the grain, the black grain, the American grain, the modern grain. Think for yourself. And that line 24a in Plato's Apology. Parrhesia is the cause of my unpopularity. What is parrhesia? Frank speech, fearless speech, unintimidated speech, plain speech, cut against the grain. Say what you mean and mean what you say. Take your mask off. Lay bare your arguments. Put forward your evidence. Draw your reliable conclusions. Follow where it goes. Socratic legacy. That's what's at work in the corpus of our dear brother William Julius Wilson. And yes, it's mediated with that deep sense of vocation of the American scholar, delivered August 31, 1837, right next door in the first parish by Ralph Waldo Emerson, the Phi Beta Kappa. He said, I'm looking for an American scholar. And one of the benchmarks of that American scholar will be what? That they'll defer never to popular cries. They'll think for themselves. that they'll shatter parochialism and provincialism, but in a spirit of intellectual humility, which means like a great jazz musician, like Ella Fitzgerald, John Coltrane, I'm going to learn how to listen to the arguments of others. One of the ways in which our dear brother Wilson always has a group of persons that he talks to, collaborators in dialogue as he formulates the framework, the argument, the vision, the ways in which one attempts to make sense of the suffering of the least of these. And then phronesis, the practical wisdom. How to proceed in such a way that you hold at arm's length all forms of purity, all forms of abstract utopia. But you begin with the lived experiences of the people you are caring for and look at the world through their lens. How ironic in a white supremacist civilization that the very peak of the very Western traditions that at their worst committed crimes against black people, at their best enabled black people to come to terms with the crimes. And when you talk about Socratic figures, when you talk about the American scholar, you're looking at one of the great ones right there, Ralph Waldo Emerson, having that in mind. And yes, even when we go to Europe, those two great essays on vocation by Max Weber, 1917, November 7th, right in the midst of World War I. Weber says, we have got to come to terms with a sense of calling in the academy because the academy is becoming so corporatized and commodified and specialized that people are losing a sense of what the forest looks like as others are preoccupied with simply shining the various nuts in the corner. We need a synecdochic imagination, a relation of parts and whole, not simply highly specialized disciplines that are tied to various financial incentives to reproduce an academy more and more distant from speaking to public life, distant from speaking to everyday people. And what does Emerson say? Focus on the poor, the low, the oppressed. What does Weber say? Provide clarity in a spirit of integrity. And 14 months later in Science as a Vocation. Well, no, really, it's politics as a vocation. The first one, science. Politics as a vocation. In 1919, the war's over. He says there's an ethics of conviction and an ethics of responsibility. But that rare person will be she or he who can make them mutually together, bring them together in dialectical interplay, complementary. And he says that will be the scholar with a vocation to be a scientist and politically engaged. That is very, very rare. What we have in Professor William Julius Wilson is this preoccupation with science, rigorous analysis, meticulous empirical investigation, concerned about fallible conclusions drawn, but always informed by a vision of those left out. And he was always being sensitive to the particularity of black suffering and the universality of human suffering across the board. This is the best of the modern American human black intellectual tradition. And he begins in part on the chocolate side of town because so many of his fellow colleagues, past and present, like to talk about structures and institutions, like to talk about agents and subjects, but rarely get around to the humanity of those on the chocolate side of town. And he's coming out of a discipline of Herbert Spencer. You mentioned Spencer. You know what Spencer thinks of black folk. Or Warren William Graham Sumner in Folkways. You know what Sumner thinks of black folk. These are the pillars of the discipline itself. And then in Chicago in 1892, here comes Albion Small, the founder of the sociology department. After being president at Colby. Actually, he got a theological degree from Andover Newton, but he's trained in Germany. But he would be the founder of the Journal of Sociology, 1895 to 1935. That's a long time. And given the Rockefeller money, he said, we are going to create a whole new discipline called sociology. And with George Vincent, Vincent was the son of Bishop John Vincent, who was the founder of Chautauqua. They write the textbook, influenced by Spencer. What about the black folk? What about the poor folk? Now there was Edward Bemis. He's different, but he loses his job. He's fired. So much for academic freedom. He sides with the workers in the Pullman strike. The Zeppelin, he's fired too. He's too progressive. You see. So the discipline is in the shaping and the molding of truncated paradigms, rigorous methodology, analytical sophistication, but very, very parochial vision in terms of the humanity of persons across the board. And we can go on and on with the story. I won't do it. I think Jane Addams and Florence Kelley are very, very important here with the whole house papers and maps. Especially Florence Kelley, who was a Marxist who translated Engels and Marx and got to know Engels and didn't like him. Engels had sharp analysis of the working class, but he wasn't in love with workers. Even his companion, Mary, was a worker. He didn't treat her right, but of course that's a very dominant male attitude, past and present. Not treating the sisters right, but that's another lecture. But the point is this. When that Chicago school has to come to terms with poor people, and especially poor black people. W.I. Thompson will have something to say about poor Polish peasants. Yes, indeed. Robert Park will have something to say about black folk as the ghostwriter of Booker T. Washington. But it's not until that genius in the making born in Terry County, growing up in Blairsville, Pennsylvania, provides this 1978 text. And the title, highly misleading, got my dear brother in a whole lot of trouble. First time I ever set eyes on my brother, and I came in a solidaristic spirit. I said, oh, the legacy of Du Bois, the legacy of black metropolis, concerned about the lower class, the upper class, the middle class, concerned about where things are going and the moral flabbiness of America and what are the connections between the metropolis in Chicago and the metropolis all around the world and the escalating fascism that's at the very end of that text, the pages 766 and 767. That's the legacy of William Julius Wilson. When I went to Philadelphia, I said, very few understood what he was doing because that declining significance of race, people are thinking, oh my God, he's become a neoconservative. He thinks that racism is disappearing. He's going to be highly, highly prized and acclaimed. And some of us had to say, quit lying about our brother. Read the text. Read the text. Where's your sophistication? The deracialization in the economic sphere does not mean that white supremacy is still not operating in the social, in the communal, in the political spheres. But there's some changes going on in the global and domestic economy. And class divisions are real. E. Franklin Fraser's great text of 1955 on the black bourgeoisie is now crystallizing in a way that we have got to come to terms with it. and the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem, of our precious Jewish brothers and sisters who provided a conception of what it means to be human. To be human is to spread hesed, that loving kindness, that steadfast love to the weak, the vulnerable, the orphan, the motherless, the poor, the persecuted, the subjugated, the ghetto poor, the underclass. I put them all in inverted commas. Because Brother Wilson, he abandoned a number of them because it was misunderstood. But he's looking at the world through the lens of those precious human beings who are being overlooked by other precious human beings because of the powerful callousness and coldness. Now, I was glad to see my dear brother Clinton. I love that brother. I'm a Christian. I try to love everybody. But if he had listened to our dear brother, there wouldn't have been a 1996 welfare reform bill. Is that right? It wouldn't have been. Brother Wilson was talking about, let's go back to the Hawkins bill of 1978. Let's talk about full unemployment. Welfare programs are too contingent. They can be eliminated. It can generate attitudes and orientations that need to be radically called into question. I'm looking at my dear brother Glenn Lowry. Love this brother too. Brilliant as he can be, bringing his analysis to the conversation, the Socratic dialogue. How do you keep track of structure and institution on the one hand? How do you keep track of new structures of feeling and values? Not culture of poverty in the pejorative sense, but the degree to which various adaptations to oppression can become forms of blindness and new impediments for organizing, mobilizing. But why was it that the black middle class leadership opted much more with welfare programs rather than full employment? That's a fork in the road. Thank God for bed rusting on the domestic front. As a pro-imperial thinker, that's another lecture. Thank God for A. Philip Randolph, who had already laid the seeds of the sophisticated and subtle new paradigm and problematic that William Julius Wilson was bringing to the public fore. And my God, it was an intense time. It was beautiful to be alive, to see our soft-spoken, gentle William Julius Wilson looked like, or at least, let me put it this way, he had the spirit of Jesus in the temple running out the money changers. He said, you intellectuals can talk about racism as it reflects the aspirations of the black bourgeoisie and black middle class all you want. I have nothing against them, but my fundamental stress is going to be on black poor people and working people. You can talk about affirmative action all you want. I support it, but affirmative action is not affecting those on the bottom. Things are getting worse down there. Things are getting more intense, more terrorized, more traumatized down there. I am standing with them over against you. That's what I saw in Philadelphia. I was just in my 20s. I was bringing my Marxist analysis. No, you're not talking about relations of exchange. You're talking about the relations of production. You're talking about asymmetric relations of power at the workplace. And you're talking about multiracial coalitions. And you're talking about class struggle. And you're talking about the American empire and its work in Vietnam, Latin America, and other places. You see, what a time. What a dialogue. And yet, and I'm going on much too long, and yet, here we are, both celebrating our dear brother, but also bitterly acknowledging that his genius, his love, his sacrifice, his service, that he's done all that he could do, still leaves us at this moment in a condition of relative defeat. He wasn't listened to the way he should have. He wasn't understood the way he should have. And I'm glad we've got some younger generation folk, because this is simply not a celebration of we old people gone through hell and high water. I see Brother Preston Williams there with Connie. Now, I know I hate to call Preston old, but he's 90-something, so I guess he qualified. Yes, we support each other. But the question will be, and I love what you said about his work will never disappear, to read Declining Significance of Race today, in which class issues are at the center, broadly accepted. Now, what you going to do with it? What forms of organizing will you do? What new kinds of cultural orientations will you do? What will be the relation of those who raise those issues in a privileged, commodified, neoliberal university to the hell that those folk are catching on the block? Systemic lack of employment opportunities. That's how he put it in the good kind lectures. You see. The challenge is still there. And for us to know that he is in our midst, has been in our midst, and Socratically forcing us to adapt new lens to view our economy, not through the stock market, but through prisons, through decrepit housing, through joblessness, through inadequate housing in decrepit schools, as I mentioned before, you see. And thank God there are some young people who are waking up. Brother Brandon and others will tell us. Brother Jesse understands. Elizabeth understands. Building on this Socratic legacy, this prophetic legacy, taking seriously what it means to be an American scholar, what it means to have an intellectual vocation, and an invocation of those who came before, and don't refuse to be provocative. Controversy is the very conduit. It's the brook of fire through which one must pass if one is going to ascend to the levels of a William Julius Wilson. We love you, my brother. It's hard to believe you are retiring, but you will never, ever, ever, ever disappear in the discourse of ourselves and those who come after, who build on Socrates, who build on Hebrew scripture in a secular or religious mode, concerned about the poor, who build on Emerson, cutting against the grain, who build on Weber, bringing the ethics of conviction with the ethics of responsibility, and then dipping it in the blues culture of an enslaved and a Jim Crowed and Jane Crowed people. And that blues culture is all about always acknowledging we are on intimate terms with catastrophe. And if it hasn't got to your house yet, sooner or later it will. We love you, brother. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being here. That was a good start, I think. So there's a reception at the back, so please join us, and we'll see you tomorrow.